If you've ever done any work with .NET Core, you've probably seen the ILogger interface. Maybe you even know that .NET Core has logging built in by default. But how do you use it? How do you configure it? Can you replace it? And is that a big deal? These are some of the questions that this video will tackle. We're going to look at what is provided out of the box for .NET Core projects and how to use it effectively. Now, the source code for today's video is available to download using the link below in the description. You'll also find links there to sign up for my mailing list and for my Patreon. As you watch this video, please post your thoughts and questions in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond to you. Now, if you haven't come across me before, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. One of the ways I do that is by teaching context. There are a lot of tutorials out there that will teach you what to do. I go a few steps beyond that to show you when to do it, why you should do it or should not do it, what the pitfalls are to avoid, and what the best practices are. Basically, I get you ready for the real world. If that's the type of training you're interested in, subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon to be notified when I release new videos. Okay, let's get started. We're going to create a new project. Now I'm using Visual Studio 2019, the preview version, which has the latest bits in it. In this case, I'm going to select an ASP.NET Core web application. I'm going to call this Logging Demo and Logging Demo App for the solution name. I hit Create, and I get my choice of what type of project to create. Now, this is one case where you may deviate a little bit from me when you create your demo application. So if you're following along, if you don't have the preview version of Visual Studio, you probably don't have ASP.NET Core 3.0. I'm going to select 3.0 because there are a couple of tweaks in how logging works, actually how dependency injection works in .NET Core 3.0 that will change how we do a couple of things. And so I'll try to point those out, but most of this project will work exactly the same if you're in .NET Core 2.2. So if you want to choose 2.2, that's fine, or even 2.1, but I am choosing the .NET Core 3.0, which isn't quite ready for production. It's almost. It's going to be released, I believe, in September, and this is pretty much the stable version right now for .NET Core 3. So we're going to select Web Application. Over here on the right, I'm not going to choose Authentication. I am going to configure HTTPS just because that should be a default. And I will not use Docker support. Notice down here, my .NET Core version is the .NET 3 Preview 8 version. We'll hit Create. And once that creates, we'll get a basic web application for Razor pages. And if we open up our Solution Explorer here, we can see that we have a few pages in shared, we have a couple of them shared, we have a few down here including index.cshtml. If you open up index.cshtml, we'll notice this ILogger here. And that's what we're going to cover today. What is that ILogger? Where does it come from? How does it get configured? And how do we use it? So the first place to look in .NET Core, whenever you have a configuration thing like this, there's two places. One, look in Startup to see if there's anything configured in Startup. And in this case, I'll give you a hint. There's not. There's nothing in Startup for logging here. And then we can go to program.cs, which is the entry point for our application, to see if there's anything configured here for logging. Now, if you notice the green squigglies, just so you know, the reason why is because they want me to switch over to the block body method instead of this lambda expression, which I'm actually going to do. So I'm going to say use block body method instead of the lambda, and I'll configure that to look a little nicer. So right here is where logging gets configured. And if you can't see it, I understand that. It's right here under Create Default Builder that logging gets configured. And how do I know that? Well, if I hit F12 to go to the definition here for create default builder. And we expand out this comment here. It tells me all the things that default builder does, which is very helpful because we don't see it normally unless we do some looking at Microsoft source code. But in general, this just gives us a good overview of what's happening inside this default builder. And if we look right down here, configure the Microsoft.extensions.logging.ILogger factory to log to the console, debug, and event source outputs. So that's the default configuration for logging. Now, what does that mean? We'll get into that in a minute. But just know that that's where logging by default happens. Now, also in here is enable scope validation on a dependency injection container when the host is in development. And there's some other things in here that may be of interest to you. So there's other things that this does, but one of the things it does is it configures default logging. And it logs to debug, console, and the event source. So let's do this. Let's just show off what happens out of the box with nothing being touched. No configuration changes. I'm going to launch this as logging demo, not IS Express, because I want to see the console. The console pops up when I run it from itself, a self-hosted console. So there's the console. And notice here, if we scroll to the top, we have info and then what's going on. We have info and what's going on. All the way down here, we have lots of information events. This is logging, and it's baked into Microsoft's code. So Microsoft has put logging into their own code and said, ILogger can pick this up as well. And so we capture things like, let's look at the very top here, now listening on, and there's the web URL for HTTPS and the one for HTTP. So we can capture this information right out of Microsoft's code. That logger is picking that up as an information event. So again, right out of the box, that happened. So this is console logging, where we log to a console. Makes sense, right? And then over here in Visual Studio, we have debug logging. And if we move this over, this is the same information basically. So if we come down here, and debug gets a lot more full with other stuff. But notice the Microsoft hosting lifetime information now listening on, and there's the HTTPS port and the HTTP port. So that has captured the logging information as well. So that's out of the box. We didn't configure anything. It just kind of happened by magic. And if you know me, I'm not a big fan of magic because magic, when it breaks, is a major problem. Because now you have to learn how the magic works before you can even learn why the magic is broken before you can fix the problem. And that to me is an issue. So I want to know more about how this system works, how it's configured, and how I can use it. Let's start off with the basics. And the basics are that we want to change where we're logging to, or at least control it ourselves instead of letting Microsoft control it behind the scenes. So to do that, we have this. This is how we set up and run our application. We first create the host builder with arguments that are passed in from the command line, if there are any. We then do the build action, and then we do the run action. And the build action comes down here. This is the this is the host builder. So this is this right here. It comes down and it runs these configurations, and then it builds it, and then it runs it. So what we're going to do is modify this create host builder, the configuration section, and we are going to add in our own configurations. So we have host.createDefaultBuilder. That's where the ILogger gets configured by default. And then we have configure web host defaults. Well, we're going to add another section in here. And notice it's a little bit hard to see because of the Lambda expression and all the rest. But we have this statement, and then we have dot configure web hosting or web host defaults. Well, this can be chained because this returns an iHost builder. So I can chain an additional action in here. For example, configure logging. And I can chain this at before or after the configure web host defaults. I'm going to do before. So configure logging, and then in here I'm going to create a Lambda expression that passes in two parameters. First, the context, and second, the logging information. And I say Lambda expression, and then open and close curly braces. And I'm all set. So it looks just like this pattern here. It's just that it says configure logging instead of configure web host defaults. With that, I can now change my configuration for my logging. Let's do that. Let's start off by clearing out what Microsoft has done for us. So logging dot clear providers. That means clear out everybody that's listening for logging events. Next, let's add some configuration. Now, configuration is how we configure our loggers. What's listening, who's listening, what it's listening to, those types of things. So, add configuration. We're going to say context. That comes from this variable right here, context. Context dot configuration. This is going to pull from our appsettings.json or our key vault or whatever we have configured already to have settings in it. We're going to get the section called logging. Okay, and that's going to be our configuration. Now, what is that? Well, by default, we're already given this section, and we're just using it. But this is an appsettings.json, and if you notice, we have a section called logging. That's what I'm referring to. And so when I say over here, get me the section titled logging, and then add that information, that's what this is right here, add that information into the add configuration, it's going to take this entire section as an object and load it into the configuration. So we have, this section right here. So I had few curly braces. So the log level and then the settings underneath that. And we'll get into what all these settings mean, but for right now, this is the default configuration that we get out of the box with a web application. So we're going to load that in by default. We're going to load that configuration. And then from there, we're going to add our own loggers, things to log to. So logging dot add debug. That's the debug window. That's the output right here. That's what this is. And then let's add one more. Logging dot add console. And that's the window that we saw that started up our application or our website. So we're adding two back in. We're not adding all three back in, just the two that we actually want to use. So this is a good time to talk about what's provided out of the box. What do we get from Microsoft directly to log to? Now, I'm not going to use debug and console today, but there are other options. For example, one of the ones that by default is turned on is event source. And that you have to use a tool to read, and it's not something that I've typically used, but it's available to you. We also have event log, which is your Windows machine, or I'm not sure if it will write to Mac and Linux as well. I assume it does, but that would be your debug info warn critical events actually in your Windows machine, your event log. So your event log, a trace source, I believe it's only for .NET Framework projects. We also have Azure App Services file, and also Azure App Services blob. So those are two storage types in Azure App Services, in case you couldn't have guessed. And those will store information so you can capture it on your Azure dashboard and see it directly from either a file on your web app, so it stores file or files on your web app, or you can store a file in blob storage instead, which usually makes a little more sense because the file can get wiped away pretty easily, but your blob storage can last a little longer. And the big one that I'm not going to cover today, but you really need to look into, and I will do a separate video entirely on this, and that is Application Insights. Application Insights is what you can use for application telemetry to find out what's happening with your application, where is it operating, all those types of things in Azure. And it is a whole topic unto itself. It's not something I can quickly give you the high-level overview of in this course or this video, just because there's a lot to it, and I want to make sure we get it right. And so we're going to do a whole video on application insights, because they are quite important to any application, especially ones that go into Azure. Now, I believe these four right here do need to have a NuGet package installed in order to add them, but they are provided by Microsoft. So they are Microsoft provided kind of first-party loggers. But for today, we're just going to focus on debug and console. Now, if you're looking at this list and saying, wait a minute, where's SQL Server? Where's text files? Where is, and there's a whole list of other things you could get. And that's where, we'll cover it a little bit later, but that's where you bring in a third-party logging system that integrates into the ILogger interface, which allows you to add more things into this and have larger options. With that, though, I'll emphasize it later as well, but I want to emphasize it now too, just so we have it doubly covered, and that is be careful what you're logging and where you're logging it to. Logging is supposed to be very, very quick. It's supposed to be just basic information, and it should not slow your application down. With that being said, the way that this logging system is designed is it runs synchronously. It does not have an asynchronous way of doing logging. And that seems at first like a limitation. However, that's intentional. And the reason why is because logging should not be a long-running process. And if you have short-running processes, it's actually slower to make them asynchronous than to keep them as synchronous code. So that's why they're synchronous. But if you're looking at logging to something like, let's say, SQL Server, maybe you want to think about logging to an intermediate place first, and then having something else, a background process, pick up that information and put it into SQL Server, just so that lag time does not slow your main application down. Also note that logging is not supposed to be used for critical data. This is, we hope we get it in, just throw it in, keep going information. This is not the, we have to have this information in exactly this way. Logging does not guarantee that you will capture all the log files. So just be aware of that. If you're looking to log specific information that has to be stored, let's say with a transaction, or it has to be stored no matter what and never removed, maybe there's other options for you besides using the logging framework. All right, so that's enough kind of caveats there. I want to make sure we're clear on that. This is much more for informational purposes, primarily for debugging and monitoring your application. That's the primary purpose for logging. So let's move on. So what is happening right here? Well, we're configuring our system to use a specific type of logger from Microsoft right now. And that logger is going to come across the ILogger interface, so that when we are on the index.cs, html.cs code page, we can ask for an ILogger. And that will get our configured logger that we configured over here in program.cs. Now let's just prove that that's the case by coming back to program.cs and turning off the debugger. So no debug output, instead just the console. If we run this and wait for it to start up, you'll notice that while there's calls going on in this output window here, there's not going to be in the there's going to be on the console, but not in the output window. And it seems to be paused right here. I'm not sure why it is paused. Oh, I had to hit enter. Okay, so notice all these info messages that didn't hit this window over here. They're not in the output. There's no information messages at all. Instead, it's just on the console. So you've told the debugger, you know what? I don't need you. I'm going to turn you off. Let's just go ahead and do it on the console. So that just kind of indicates that yes, we are operating correctly, and we can turn either the debugger off, or if we wanted to, we could turn the console off and have just the debugger. You'll notice all the events will pop up here, but the console itself is just a blinking cursor even though our web page is loaded. So both options are available to you if you want, just to kind of indicate that yes, we are manipulating how the ILogger gets set up. So let's talk through next this right here. So we ask for an ILogger from our dependency injection system, but we pass in a type of the class that we're currently in. What does that do and why do we do it? Well, this is what's called a category. And this allows us to categorize our different messages in our logging system. So let's run this again, and we're going to look at those categories. So this is the category right here. That's the category name. Let's add our own message here on get. So underscore logger, log info or information. Let's just give it a message. This is our first logged message. And let's watch what the category is for this log statement. Now if we scroll up here, we should find our message. And there it is. Logging demo.pages.index model. And then it has this 0 in square brackets. And it says this is our first logged message. So there's our error message, or our information message, let's say. So how does it know that it's logging demo.pages.index model? Well, it pulls it off of that type. Notice if I mouse over it, it says logging demo.pages.index model. So it has pulled that full name off and uses that as our category for our log. Now, we did not pass into our log information is any type of ID. And that's something optional you can pass in. So if we were to stop this, I'll leave this open. You can do that now, where you can leave your window open. It's just that's no longer attached to your application. I'm going to leave that open. If we come back over here and do our Control-Shift-Space, this is our first overload for this. But we do have this event ID. And so if you want, you can associate IDs with specific events. And then you can either put them in as just an integer, like so, which seems like it would be a confusing process because you have to remember what is 1001, what does it mean, or you can create a class that has constants in it. So let's just say you create, and we'll do it here just to show it off. I'm not going to keep it, but you could say public class logging ID. Let's call it logging ID singular. And then inside there we can have a public const int, and let's call it demo code equals 1001, like so. And then up here, we could say logging ID dot demo code, like so. And then you can reuse this everywhere, and you can refer to it based upon the name, but then it puts the ID number in there. Then when we run this, we'll run it again, and this time it'll have an ID besides that 0 in the square brackets. All right, so we'll bring this over, and up here, oh, it's hard to find it at first. There we go. Our logging demo.pages.index model, the ID is 1001, and it says this is our first logged message. So if you want to have IDs, that's the way of going about it. You don't have to have IDs though. You can just skip that and then not pass anything in. All right, next let's talk about the different levels of log. So the very bottom level, the most, probably the thing that you won't use very often, but logger.trace, log trace. This is a trace log. And then logger.log debug. This is a debug log. And then log information. I'll just change that message to this is an information log. Logger.log warn or warning. This is a warning log. Logger.log error. And finally, logger.log critical. Like so. So these are different levels from least significant to most significant. Okay, so let's talk through what each of these is generally used for. And you can use it for your own thing, but in general, this is how these messages are used. These two are mostly for pretty heavy debugging. Typically, trace logs are logs that will have a really detailed view in what's going on, and it may even have some application secrets in those trace logs. Next is debug, and that's where you kind of the next level up from trace, but it's still some pretty heavy debugging information about, this is what the data is for this value or things like that. Information is more, this is stuff you'll probably keep in your logs. This is more a flow of how your applications are being used. So we're going from this step to this step to this step for this customer or things like that. And you can kind of trace through how your application is being used. A warning is where you have an issue. Let's just say you throw an exception that you catch. So there's something that maybe the user says, open this file, and the file wasn't there. You would catch that exception because you've planned for the idea that the user gives you a bad file name. But you'd want to log that as a warning. Now the next level is error, and that's where there's an exception that may kind of crash part of your application. It's unexpected, it's unhandled at a low level, maybe it pops up quite a ways, and you maybe can't do something. For example, maybe there's something where, the database wasn't available temporarily. That could be an exception that happens. Or when you went to write to the log file was corrupted and it couldn't be written to. And so you couldn't do that right that you were expecting to. And so that would be an error. And then critical, this last one, this is like the application is crashing, the whole thing is down, there's some kind of massive issue, maybe you're losing data, maybe there's a customer made a purchase, but before you could put it in a database, something happened and you're losing that sale. Or the server is out of disk space, and so the application has come to a crashing halt. These are the type of things that you log as critical logs. In general, the two most used and that you'd capture are these two right here. Information, what's going on, and then warning, what went wrong that we expected. In general, you hope you don't have too many errors that were unexpected or that crashed sections of your application. And for sure you hope that critical things don't happen. But these are important things to remember to log. Let's just see these in the console just to see how this would look. All right, so let's grab the console and bring it back over here. And we'll scroll up here and we have our debug. This is our debug log. We have our information. We have our warning. We have our failure or the error log. And we have our critical, which is a critical log. So if you're scrolling through the console looking for issues, they'll pop right out if they're warnings, failures, and critical for sure because of the color change. So that's how they look in the console, but whatever logging tool you use or logging output you use can be different in how it's displayed. So over here, if we look at the logging, you can't tell the difference. They say the difference, but that's about it. So you can't really tell, oh, that's more important because it's critical. So that's the different logging levels. Now we do have the option of appending information in our message. So I'm going to comment this out. So you have these. Now let's logging levels. Okay? And now let's look at the additional information you could put into a message. So logger.log, let's do log error just so that we have that red to catch our eye. So in here we can say our message is the server went down temporarily at time. I put that in curly braces. And then afterwards, I put comma, date time dot UTC now. Now what's going to happen is we're going to take this value and put it in this spot. And you may look at that and say, Tim, that doesn't look right. It looks like we should have string interpolation, we should put a $sign there, and then just put inside here datetime.utc now. And that was my first thought. But there is a reason why we do it this way, or why Microsoft did it this way. I say we. I had nothing to do with it. The reason why it's done this way is because there are certain logging frameworks that can log in a larger manner. And that's called either semantic logging or structured logging. And what will happen is they will store this information in a separate place, usually in a JSON object or something similar, where they'll say time and then store the time, and then display this message right here with the time inserted. But that way, when you go to search your logs, you can actually filter based upon the time when the log was entered, because you have this time in the as a separate variable. So there is a benefit to not merging that into just one string that you send to the logger. If you send it as an argument, then you can pull that back out later in certain logging frameworks. Now, if you'll notice, I call this time, but how does it know that this right here is time? And the way it does that is based upon position. So it's just about, this is the first parameter, therefore I grab the first parameter and value and put it into the first parameter spot. So if I had another parameter, say Tim, then it would take Tim and put it in the time spot. Okay, and just, it's not because Tim starts with TIM and time does too. Joe, the same thing. It would just put it in that spot. So make sure that your parameters are in the correct order for what you're inserting. So if you insert a new parameter up here, like so, datetime.utc_now goes over here now, not here. If you want it in both places, you'd have to do something like this. Okay? So that's how the logging works. Let's just, again, run it and see it in action. And there's our failure, and it says the server went down temporarily at, and then it has the date and time. So that can be a pretty powerful way of sending additional information to our log message. We can get even more information if we have exceptions. Let's just say we have a try catch, and this catch has an EX, and then inside here we're not going to rethrow the exception, but instead we're going to say logger dot, let's do critical, and say EX, comma, there was a bad exception at, and then let's put a time here. All right, so we've now passed in EX, or the whole exception, as part of our log message. And this is one of the overloads for the different types of log messaging. So if we run this now, let's pull it over here. We see our fail right here. The server went down temporarily at, and that's our failure. I don't see our other message. And the reason why is we never threw an exception. You should probably yell at me right now. So throw new, let's call it a, just call it exception, and say this is a, you forgot to catch me. Okay, that's our exception message. And now if we run this, we should get that critical alert that something went wrong. And in fact, we do. So this is the message. Notice it's actually all the way down to here. So there is where it came from, logging demo.pages.index model. There was a bad exception, and there is the time. So that's the message that we created. And then here is the system exception. You forgot to catch me. And where was it? There's the location in the source code, and there's the line in the source code. So that's how you catch an exception and pass it through to your logger. Now let's comment this. Let's call it advanced logging messages. So we can comment this out in just a minute, but first I want to move on to the next piece, which I promised you I'd get to, and that is appsettings.json, where we have this information. And this is how the logging is configured. So right now we only have one logging level configured, and that is for everything. It doesn't matter the logging type. So we're going to change this, but for right now, let's look at what just this default does. And it says, by default, I want you to log information only. Now, if you caught it earlier, when we called this, when we called this message right here, these two, I'm sorry, this one, it didn't capture trace information. And that's because we weren't actually capturing that. So we'll change that in a bit. But by default, it says log information level and higher. But for Microsoft categories, these are categories. So for Microsoft categories, I want you to show only warning messages and higher. Meaning Microsoft's got a lot of information stuff in there. Don't capture that. But then we have this more specific rule, and that is Microsoft.hosting.lifetime. And it says, well, actually, you want to see information above for the lifetime. So what happens if we decide, you know what, we don't want anything from Microsoft? Well, we could delete this and change this to none or to critical, but we'd still see stuff from Microsoft. So instead what we need to have a little bit more generic rule by saying Microsoft star. And for that, I want to see only, let's do warning. Any kind of exceptions that are caught, that's fine. But for everything else, I want this, and I am going to even take these. Let's just change this to warning as well, because I want to leave it in here so you can see it, but we don't want these to be anything below warning either. Now if we run this application, you'll see a big difference in what gets logged. There's our logs. That's everything. Just 2 log entries, and they're both from us. Our critical and our failure. If we come back over here, we comment out this section, and we uncomment this section here. We run it again. We'll see debug, info, warn, fail, and critical. Now, interestingly enough, we're not supposed to be seeing this debug message, at least not according to our configuration. And I believe in production we wouldn't. But since we're running Visual Studio, it might be that's the reason. But we're saying info and above, and so we should be seeing just these messages, not this one. We don't see trace though. So if we come back over here to our app settings, let's change the default to trace and run this again and see if we get a different result. And we don't. So let's do this. Let's close this down and let's look at, we're going to expand out, let's change this back to information. We're going to expand out this logging section to be specific to a specific type. In this case, console. And then inside here, what we'll do is we will add our log level. And then in here, we'll set the default to be trace. Now let's run this. And notice we get a lot of stuff in here, including there's our trace, debug, info, warn, fail, and critical. So if we then add in this right here where we say Microsoft, you know what, only show warning and above, but for everything else, for our stuff, do trace, then we should see just our trace message and above. And there we go. So trace, debug, info, warn, fail, and critical. So the console by default was not taking the log level from this default. It was ignoring that for what levels to capture. And it was by default, on its own defaults, saying, I want debug and higher. And so this is where we can say, well, no, actually, I want you to be trace or higher. So for console, trace level or higher, notice that does not affect the debug instead. So we could set our own section here for debug as well. So we could say debug, and the log level is going to be warning for both ours and Microsoft's. And now if we run this and look at our output here, we'll see a different scenario, and that is that we have just 3 log messages, and that is warning, error, and critical. And over here in our window here, we see trace, debug, info, warn, fail, and critical, because console has a different set of parameters than debug does. So if you want to make sure you specify different levels for different outputs, whether it be the console or the debug, or if you use other things like event log, this is how you do it. You come into your appsettings.json, and under the logging section, the top level is the name of the type of logger. So in this case, console or debug. And then if you don't have one, it should take the log level for the default. And that may happen in production, is not in debugging mode. I'm not positive on that one. But this allows you to specify for sure what those levels are. So I would recommend against ever deploying anything that had trace turned on. I would say start off with your information, and then the nice thing is, because this is an appsettings.json file, you can change it at runtime. So you can change it to trace if you want to hear more information about what's going on inside of your application. So that's why it's in these files instead of in code. That's one of the questions I often get is, well, can't I do this inside C# code? And the answer is yes, you can configure your logging information inside C# code. But there are limited reasons why you would want to do that. And they're probably not as many reasons as you would think. Because in general, you want to pull this from some external configuration system so that you can turn it on or off, up or down, depending on the client that it's deployed on and the situation. Okay? So there's the different logging levels per logger. Now, there's a couple things I haven't covered yet. One is, so far we have just seen how to do this right here, where we are passing in the object that we're in, the class that we're in, and that captures and creates the category based upon the full namespace. So loggingdemo.pages.index model. But what if you wanted to change that and not use the class name for some reason? Now, this is the convention to do it this way. But if you decide, you know what, I don't want to do it that way. Instead, what I want to do is I want to do it where I specify what that name is. First of all, this isn't necessary either way. You can just say ILogger, because it is an ILogger. You don't have to give it the type. And second, if you want to change this, let's just copy this. I'm going to comment this out and then paste it back in so you can have a different version. So I'll say this is the, whoops. Yeah, I was trying to do 2 double slashes so that I can, when you uncomment it, the comment is still here. And this is the standard way of capturing the category. But what if you don't want to go the standard route? You want to do it your own way. So instead, what you would do is say ILogger factory. And I call it factory. Some people call it logger still. That doesn't make sense to me. So logger factory, what you're going to do is you're going to say factory.create logger and give it your category name. So in this case, I'm going to say demo category. If you spell it right. And that's it. I'm not going to give it the loggingdemo.pages.demo category, just demo category, that's it. That's now the category for these messages. So if we run this again, we'll see that that's the category name. So the category name is now demo category. So if you really want to change what your category names are, that's how you do it. You ask for a factory, for the ILogger factory instead of the ILogger, and then you create the logger and pass in this information. And you may ask, well, is that less efficient to do it that way? And the answer is no. It's the same amount of efficiency as if you did it the standard way like this. Now, yes, it's more lines of code, but as far as C# compiled code and all kind of stuff, it's the same. Because what happens is this right here, what that's doing is it's passing in this type, and then it's doing a factory.create logger and passing in the name. It's going to say name of and then the type. So it's the same thing, whether you do it your own way or whether you do it this way, which is a more standard method. The other thing that I haven't really touched on, but sometimes people want to do, is over here in static void main, the question comes up, how do I log that my application started? And that takes a couple of steps. So right now we've chained the create host builder and then build and then run. We're going to break that up into 2 steps. So let's say var host equals like so. And then we can say var, actually let's do it up here. I'll be consistent, say var logger equals host.services.get required service. And so I'll add my using statement there. And then I'm going to ask for an ILogger of type, and let's give it program. Like so. And now I have a logger. So what I've done is I've asked the dependency injection system for a service, and that service is ILogger. And so now I have that ILogger. I can say logger dot log information. The application has started. Like so. We probably put the time and date, those types of things in there. Certain log systems have the time and date by default. You don't need to pass it in. So, and then afterwards, after we've done that, then we say host.run to finish off what was in this chain. So with all of that being done, let's make sure that we're actually capturing info. I believe we are, but yep, we're capturing information messages. So we pull this over here. The application has started. So that's how you capture use the logger when you're in your main method. All right, with all that being covered, and I know I covered it pretty quick, but you can go back and kind of look at the different sections as you need them. With all that being covered, where do you go from here? Well, I think to start off with, you stop right here. This is good enough. This will help you with debugging your application, with making sure that you understand what's going on with your application, getting some telemetry there, and maybe even with capturing information in Azure using either that text file storage or the blob storage. But maybe you want to take it to the next level. Maybe you want to have more formal logs or longer term logs where you capture more performance data and stuff like that. How do you do that? Well, it's actually pretty easy. When we're configuring the logger here, if we replace this section with, let's just say we want a third-party service like Serilog. Well, Serilog, you add a couple of NuGet packages, one being Serilog itself and one being whatever sync, they call them syncs. So this right here would be a sync, and this would be as well. Basically anywhere to send data. You add the syncs that you want, and then instead of this section right here, you just say use Serilog and then pass in your configuration, and you're done. So use the same ILogger interface so that, let's just say for now, you build your applications using the built-in Microsoft configured ILogger. But down the road, you say, you know what? I think that we didn't make the right choice, or maybe we've grown out of the base ILogger from Microsoft. We need to go beyond this and store things in text files or JSON files or whatever. And so we're going to bring in Serilog. Not a problem. You just change things in program.cs. That's it. All the existing logging information that you have in place will still work. And now it works with Serilog instead of with your Microsoft default console and the debug window. So what I'm saying is it's very easy to upgrade. If you're looking for recommendations, I'll probably come out with a video on Serilog, and I'm pretty happy with that tool. But there's also tools like nlog and Elma that you can bring in, put in place here very easily. Another thing to do is to bring in that application insights. Like I said, that'll be a separate video as well as we look at what application insights are and how they can really benefit your applications, especially when you take them into the cloud. But those are the two things that you don't have to make decisions on now. In fact, I encourage you, don't over-architect your application. Start with just this. And then as you see you need better logging or longer-term logging, since this is short-term logging, just while it's running. But as you see that you need this longer-term stuff, it's not hard to turn on. And then you can upgrade your application in just a couple of minutes. All right, so that is logging that's built right into any .NET application. Hopefully you follow along. Hopefully you've seen a few things you want to improve in your applications, and hopefully this was useful to you. Like I said before, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, leave them down in the comments below. I will try my best to answer every single one and get back to you, and hopefully you have some good discussions on where you think you want this to go next. All right, thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.